Hi, everyone, and thank you for coming. I'm Francesca Tarocco, the director of NICHE, the new Institute Center for Environmental Humanities here at Ca' Foscari University of Venice. And it is my great privilege tonight to welcome the wonderful Veronica Strang. Professor Strang is one of the foremost experts on the anthropology of water, and the theme today is one that she's proposed to NICHE, and we are very happy to think with her, hopefully, about the anthropology of wonder. Veronica has so many accomplishments, impossible to list all of them, but I will just say a few things here. Of course, the book that made her name, The Meaning of Water, is now one of the key texts in the field, really one that started the field. And her most recent book, which is here in my hands, and I think all of you should read it, is Water Beings. Again, a very trailblazing text that really explore a variety of issues from the cultural history of water beings well into our times and the climate crisis. So without any further talk from me, I let the floor to Veronica. She will speak for about 45 minutes, and is happy to take questions at the end. So let's enjoy the talk. Veronica.
There is surely no better place to lecture about this topic, this beautiful city of water and light, which draws people from all around the world to try to capture its unique character in art and photography and material culture. Venice really exemplifies the reality that water and light are powerfully fascinating, mesmerizing people and eliciting deeply affective responses. So today we're going to explore the topic of wonder, the phenomenon of wonder, and ask how and why combinations of water and light evoke such powerful feelings. And of course, we'll be exploring this primarily through the lens of cultural anthropology, but this is a somewhat experimental paper, which I hope that you're going to give me very useful feedback on. It's very much a work in progress, but it draws on a range of disciplinary perspectives, including archaeology, philosophy, history, theology, art history, and so forth. And it brings art and material culture studies into a dialogue with biological and evolutionary anthropology and the cognitive sciences. And in accord with the theories of new materialism, it suggests that the material properties of water and its behaviors of water and light are co-creative in forming human phenomenological and social experience. Now, of course, maybe that one, another one. No, this one. Maybe that one. Okay, that's good. Now, there's now an extensive anthropological literature on water and materiality, and some of the same issues have been employed in thinking about the material properties of light, and other writers have given consideration to color and its effects on human perception, and to specific materials such as ivory, jade, gold, and their properties. And in each case, the inherent material properties of things provide consistent stimuli to human cognition and sensory avenues of engagement. Now, of course, ethnographers have described quite different emphases and variations in the ways that different cultures think about sensory experiences. But this, of course, is not mutually exclusive. It's not incompatible with acknowledging universality in human cognitive and sensory processes. And combinations of water and light are, of course, experienced in all cultural contexts, providing an opportunity for us to consider evolutionary as well as cultural factors and that interplay between them. So this discussion considers also the evolution of vision and pan-human responses to movement, color, and shine, and to consider how these are manifested in different cultural contexts. I'm going to draw very briefly on two ethnographic case studies, one with Aboriginal communities in the north of Australia and with the inhabitants of the Stour Valley in Dorset, which is in the south of England. And their lifeways highlight the culturally and historically specific ways in which water and light are encoded with meaning, but also point to the commonality of their sensory and cognitive processes in engaging with them. So in essence, this paper has two key aims. First, to foreground the relationship between two materialities, the embodied physical, cognitive, and sensory materialities through which we all experience the world, and then the external materialities with which they engage. And second, it suggests that with the imaginative potential of human culture, this meeting of internal and external materialities generates more than the sum of its parts, producing these very deeply affective responses and the experience of wonder. And in this regard, there's of course coherence with Merleau-Ponty's view that the body is the medium of consciousness, that perception is not applied to the world, but experienced through engagement with it. And this understanding has been further advanced by writing on embodiment, exploring how humans interact simultaneously with worlds inside and outside themselves, and how they think with external materials to compose particular cosmological understandings. Now, of course, it follows that every cultural and historical context shapes sensory experiences and produces wonder in its own ways. But as philosopher Martin Evans observes, wonder, the experience of wonder and wondering, is in part emergent from the object wondered at, and it's an emergent property of the object. So wonder is also partly emergent from the experience of the object. It is, to speak, emergent within the wanderer. Wonder is an emergent property both of the object viewed and of the viewer. And that focus on emergence links with Heidegger's concept of poiesis, which Adam Knowles translates as a mode of bringing forth into unconcealment the separate productive power of nature to create the elements of poetic production. And following Heidegger, landscape artist Barbara Bolk similarly suggests that the use of light in art is an emergent rather than representational practice, and that visual art produces real material effects. And of course, that doesn't diminish the virtuosity of artists in depicting light and water. It foregrounds the co-creative agency of these elements in their activities and in their capacities to elicit wonder. Now, of course, scholars have been thinking about wonder for a very long time. Socrates argued that wisdom begins with wonder, suggesting that the experience of wonder is a basis for enlightenment. And that assumption, which of course is reflected in a lot of religious and philosophical writing, points to the potential for wonderful engagements with water and light to have transformative effects. But what is wonder? An affective response to external stimuli, a chemically induced response to the release of endorphins, a form of heightened sensory perception, a transcendental state, perhaps, or a mode of connecting with things and places. It might be all of these things, but above all, it's a feeling of amazement, admiration, possibly love, and possibly fear. And there are multiple ways in which wonder can be triggered, as writer Margarita Lasky puts it in Write About Ecstasy. And music and other sounds, including the sounds of water, are obvious examples. And linguistic literary folk like Nigel Fabb explore the capacities of literature to create sublime experiences and produce epiphanies. But of course, wonder is often intricately connected with, one might say, integral to religious activities, and evoking feelings of wonder is the goal of many religious rituals, including the many ceremonies in which water has a central role. And the purpose of evoking wonder in a religious context is to encourage adherence to particular beliefs, and in many societies, of course, for centuries, it's been served precisely this purpose. creating congregations passionately committed to shared faith. As Thomas Carlyle put it, wonder is the basis of worship. And for some scholars, deep or sublime wonder is only possible through belief in God. So philosopher Ian Kidd argues that if you're, he says this a bit snootily, I'll try to replicate the tone, if you are an atheist like Richard Dawkins, you can't have an experience of deep wonder, only the shallow wonder of intellectual inquiry. And he cites Wittgenstein's and Feyerabend's view that science erodes a sense of wonder or mystery required for a full appreciation of human existence. And even outside conventional religions, Bron Taylor suggests that nature spirituality constitutes a form of dark green religion. And Hayden Washington argues the sense of wonder must be considered spiritual, even if it's not strictly religious, in accordance with the foundational theories of Henry Thoreau. Both suggest wonder is connected with nature. However, of course, the assumption that wonder is intrinsically religious or even spiritual is very much challenged by studies suggesting that secular aesthetic experiences can be similarly transcendental, and whether evoked by nature or by artworks and performances whose raison d'etre is to be wonderful, which brings us to the notion of an exhibition. Martin Evans points out that an exhibition can be thought of as a kind of emergence by design, a choreographed emergence, objects and situations being deliberately presented anew out of their ordinary context. And any form of exhibition, of course, focuses on the material properties of objects and images. And anthropologist Alfred Gell, writing on art and agency, suggests that images and patterns constitute instrumental action designed to evoke deeply affective responses. And his most well-known example, of course, is Trobriand canoe boards, whose swirling patterns are intended to dazzle potential participants in the cooler trading circle and persuade them to trade generously. And Gell also showed that people can be magically enchanted by demonstrations of technical virtuosity. And art historians among us would certainly recognize this fascination in their studies, just as anthropologists such as Penny Harvey and Hannah Knox have extended this kind of thinking to large-scale engineering projects such as bridges and dams and major infrastructures. And the enchantment of technology, as Gell called it, is readily observed in people's responses to major water infrastructures. So in some of the work that I've done on dams, it appears that they have a very particular allure and they induce wonder and awe, partly because of the technical expertise involved in building them, but also because of the huge instrumental power as well as dangerous forces that they represent. And of course, they create these wonderful reservoirs of shimmering water. Also refuting representations of science as being disenchanting, commentators such as David Attenborough demonstrate that wonder and awe are often produced by scientific understandings of the complexity of species and ecosystems. And in writing about wonder, Caspar Henderson notes that Heidegger's view that wonder reveals people and things as they simply are and moves us to want to safeguard the beauty and complexity of the world. And certainly combinations of water, light and light seem to be particularly wonderful. Here's Henderson again. Whatever is on my mind, the great dance of light in which it passes through air or water is occasion for meditation. I live near a river and kayak on it when I can. When it's sunny and golden light flashes on the water, I find solace in gliding across its surface. And we can see similar ideas in water mobilities and, for example, Petra Kodato's notion of hydro-perspectivism, which you may be familiar with. But Caspar's use of the word solace is an interesting clue because, as you'll know, there's an area of environmental anthropology exploring the capacities of the non-human domain to elicit feelings of love and connection in what has been described as biophilia, which Aristotle describes as a love of nature. And Ronan Foley and his colleagues employ a related notion of hydrophilia to describe people as healing. And of course, here in Venice, you have Francesco Ballerani's writing, Anifo Duncan deciding on describing this as an inborn unconscious attraction for various kinds of waterscapes. So this will be familiar territory for you. And as this implies, the wonder induced by water and light has the potential to encourage ideas and values sympathetic to the protection of the environments that provide experiences. But why should light and water together evoke such consistent affective responses? Let's consider them from a cultural anthropology point of view as their material properties and behaviors. Now, of course, physicists are still debating whether light can be considered as a material, but one way in which it's continually materialized is through its intersections with multiple forms of water. Light is revealed in and through atmospheric conditions. It's refracted through clouds and mist, reflected on water surfaces, in the serpentine glitter of streams and so forth. And together, light and water manifest some wonderful visual phenomena, aurorae, mirages, rainbows, all of which produce wonder. And we might note William Wordsworth's put it, "My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky." And who doesn't get excited, by rainbows? So if we accept that the material properties and behaviors of water, light, and color co-create people's responses to them, then there are some quite helpful evolutionary points that we might make. For most of our history, humans have existed as hunter-gatherers and as the potential prey of predators. And with other developmental priorities, human vision has not evolved to see particularly well in the dark. So it's unsurprising to find a lot of cross-cultural commonality in responses to light and dark. And these are manifested in a multiplicity of belief systems in which light and illumination are valorized and seen as agentive in bringing enlightenment, while darkness is framed more fearfully and negatively, often being linked with ideas about mortality, and in many, though not all societies, visions of darker underworlds. And this is expressed in Platonic parables about caves, darkness, and light, in biblical images of seraphim bringing burning coals to convey enlightenment, shafts of heavenly light, burning bushes, and so forth. And in older cosmologies in which, for example, in primal waters, the lotus emerges to open and bring light into the world. So in many societies, as Blumenberg says, light stands as a metaphor for truth. At a much more pragmatic level, light is the common material component in the production of color and the capacities to stimulate particular responses. So in evolutionary terms, for species that rely on colorful food sources, fruit, berries, flowers, etc., sensitivities to color and hue are adaptively advantageous. So fruit or flower seeking insects have developed vision that's very, very precise in terms of color sensitivity. And because we also have a historical reliance in evolutionary terms on fruit and berries, this ability is also important to primates. And the human eye is therefore very discriminating about color. And although all societies have developed elaborate relationships with them, encoding them with very complex symbolic meanings, evolutionary anthropologists note that particularly stimulating colors, such as red, have consistent physiological and emotive effects on people. And of course, we might even point briefly to classic evolutionary determinism, though I don't want to give this a very small space, and some obvious points about colorful plumage and reproductive advantage. But more speculatively, I think it's reasonable to suggest that as humans have broadened their activities to encompass multiple kinds of resource use, they've developed more complex symbolic systems, and they've segued from merely being keen on colorful fruit to an attraction for very intensively hued ochres and the seductive glitter of precious stones and materials. The meaning of things is so variable across cultures as the meaning of colors, but it's uncontroversial to say that all human societies share a fondness for bling, for shiny, glittery things, and with magpie-like acquisitiveness, commonly gather stuff that is shiny or intense in color. And equally consistently, they use these things to express what is symbolically valuable to them. And we might note here Hegel's discussion about the term shine, which comes from the verb scheinen. Hegel believed that art involved shine, but it was associated with the etymologically related schon, meaning beautiful. But 18th century philosophers tended to associate shine with illusion and deception, particularly in discussing the ways that paintings provided a sort of three-dimensional illusion of reality. But Hegel equated the term shine with Wesen, meaning essence. And he maintained that this remained hidden behind a veil of shine, only revealing itself through emergent processes, such as the bubbles in water. Now, here's an interesting thing, because powerful responses to shine and brilliance can be observed in endlessly diverse ethnographic contexts, as can the notion that it manifests emergent essence. So Howard Morphy describes how in Aboriginal Australia, the shimmering patterns in paintings are seen to manifest and emanate what is called Birian in Yolngu, the spiritual power of the ancestral beings held in the land. And Birian acts upon the viewer, bringing enlightenment. And as he says, this term was first translated by anthropologist Donald Thompson, who noted in a broader sense, Birian refers to intense sources and refractions of light, the sun's rays, and to light sparkling in bubbling fresh water. And then Mike O'Hanlon's work on aesthetic practices in New Guinea observes that the traditional pre-ritual practice of greasing the body with pig fat to create shining, glistening skin is said to indicate spiritual power and physical well-being. Amongst the Nuer in Africa, the shine of colorful body art traditionally expresses the health and virility of the person, and Kate Fayer's Kerr notes that the Mun of Ethiopia use a ritual technique called sheshege, which she says involves fine-tuning or realigning cosmic forces for the good of community through body painting and related techniques. Also in Africa, Jeremy Coote, talking about Nilotic cattle herders in the Sudan, describes the aesthetic appreciation that they have for the shining animals that are central to their lives. As he puts it, the sheen of the hides is appreciated and values. It indicates a sleek and healthy hide, but it should be noted that sheen is perceptually exciting in and of itself. Its appreciation can be understood as a particular manifestation of the universal appreciation of brightness. And as well as epitomizing shine, combinations of water and light are full of movement. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Scott Atran, who observed there's a strong cross-cultural consistency in ideas about animation and life. And all societies recognize, obviously, a fundamental difference between the quick and the dead. So death often entails the loss of shine. So a dead fish quickly loses the shine in its eye, the rainbow colors on its scales. And these concepts of life and liveliness are driven by ideas about animation, or what Jane Bennett describes as vibrant matter. So things that move are assumed to be alive and have the capacity to draw attention. And this connects us with another evolutionary point about the advantages of visual acuity in perceiving movement. Specialists in the development of vision across species have observed that both predation and the need to avoid being prey have produced diverse forms of visual acuity. So, for example, nocturnal predators such as cats have a fantastic capacity to spot the slightest movement. But this is also important for humans, both in hunting and in avoiding being hunted. But of course, in our case, evolutionary development has made a major increase in brain size and the development of very finely tuned sensory and motor skills. And that's been allowed us to internalize these experiences. But in discussing evolved responses to visual stimuli, psychologist Harvey Schiffman notes that the eye continually performs what he calls saccades, which I think is also a musical term. As he puts it, saccades are ballistic type movements that are guided and have a predetermined destination. So the muscles responsible for saccadic eye movements are the fastest in the body. Typically, they're 1 to 3 saccades per second, and they also have a reflexive nature. So a suddenly appearing, flickering, or moving stimulus seen out of the corner of the eye can result in a saccade that moves the gaze directly to the stimulus. And you'll all have had this experience. You see a flicker of something out the corner eye and your attention is drawn to it. So it appears that things that move, or which appear to move because of particular patterns and colors and optical effects, have an intrinsic attraction for the eye. So Jeremy Coote goes on to say that for the Dinka cattle herders, dappled beasts are particularly highly valued. And Coote's description brings to mind Gerald Manley Hopkins' poem about the importance of colorful patterns, which goes, "Glory be to God for dappled things, for skies of coupled color, such as a brindled cow." And the mesmerizing effect of flickering patterns is also evident in Bachelard's description of a flickering candle flame, to which he says, "The renewal of reverie a dreamer receives in the contemplation of a solitary flame." And we all know a fire will draw the eye really very automatically. Another apposite example is provided by art historian Richard Gamerson, who describes how in the medieval period, this is a very nice example for Venice, the church made use of triptychs, 3-part altarpieces containing religious paintings highlighted with glittering gold leaf. And these were opened, revealed to the congregation by candlelight. And the magical flickering of these glittering paintings was, of course, meant to be wonderful. So this mesmerizing effect of dappled things, light on water, firelight, candlelight, in more contemporary terms, strobe lights, flickering movie screens, or so forth, already exploited across cultures to induce transcendental states of being, religious ecstasy, trances, meditative modes, and so forth. And the reason why things that shimmer exert such powerfully hypnotic effects may also have a related visual evolutionary process in which it relates or resonates with neurological processes. And these neurological processes, what's going on inside our brains, actually contains a constant neurological fizz or shimmering of thoughts. So experimental psychologist Magdalene Vernon makes precisely this point, as she says, the visual pattern that impinges on the brain is not static. It continually moves and flickers. The light and shade and color of the pattern alter as the light reaching the eyes changes in color and brightness. So if we were conscious of this pattern, she says, we should see something like shimmering lights reflected from moving water. Of course, this effect is regularly noted by my informants in describing the effects that sitting by bodies of water that shimmer and sparkle have on them. And of course, that when people have leisure, they congregate around water to sit and gaze, as Wordsworth put it. A lake carries you into recesses of feeling that are otherwise inattainable. And part of this fascination, of course, is that water is always animated by light. The calmest pool glitters with reflections, and even the faintest breeze produces sparkles of light. So in this sense, water is always alive. And this takes us to another powerfully cross-cultural idea about life and liveliness, the recurring notion of living water, which centers not only on the material animation of water and light, but on the recognition of their necessity to all organic processes of reproduction. And this recognition that light and water create life is central to all cosmological schemes. It features in multiple origin stories as primal waters from which life emerges, often in concert with the revelation of light. Whether we consider the ancient Egyptian story of Nun, the chaotic seas from which the world is made, Aboriginal concepts of the rainbow serpent, in which embodying the waters of the land generates all kinds. We might think about various versions of Genesis in which the world's major religions, or in Maori notions of chaos, te kore, in which water and light are the fluid potentiality. Even the most pragmatic scientific story of origins centers on a vital interaction of water and light combining to create the first living organisms, with microbial life simmering away for eons in the seas before finally crawling up onto the land. So water and light are fundamentally connected with ideas about physical and spiritual generation, and diverse cultural practices are linked by centrally important ideas about how life, energy, and vital animation are made visible through glimmer and shine. And in this context, of course, it's not difficult to see why phenomena composed of water and light elicit very powerful responses. Basically, they tick all the visual and sensory boxes. They're bright, colorful, intensive in hue, they shine, they shimmer with animation. They resonate with key aspects of visual perception, and they intersect with core cultural concepts of life and death, fertility and reproduction. So if we just take a little snippet of a couple of ethnographic examples. My first case study comes from Aboriginal communities with whom I've worked in Cape York in Australia. And here there are some very wonderful ideas about water and light, and these focus particularly on the rainbow. Now, Aboriginal Australians in hundreds of small language groups have their own ancestral stories, but they share core ideas about the dreaming or story time, a creative era in which ancestral beings rose up out of the land, formed the material world and everything in it, including humans, and then sat down back into the water of the land to remain there as a source of generative power. And central to these beliefs is the rainbow serpent, from which everything emerged and critically continues to emerge. And this is in effect a sentient cultural landscape in which ancestral beings remain omnipresent, watching, nurturing, and so forth. And in this cosmology, the rainbow is not an arc, but a whole circle of life, in effect, a hydrotheological cycle as defined by Yifu Tuan. And it's probably best explained by the fact that it reflects the hydrological movement of water through the material world, carrying with it all of the generative powers of water, enabling the production and reproduction of all organic beings, as well as the spiritual movement of persons from the invisible, immaterial world of the dreaming into the material, visible world, into the light and animation of material being. And then at the end of life, they are ritually returned to their ancestral home. So every person has a home place in the land, almost always a water body, from which their spirit emerges at the beginning of life, animating the fetus in a woman's body. And then this is the, in Kunjan, which is one of the language groups that I work with in Cape York, this translates as Erk Elampunk, which is El means I, Erk means place. And this basically translates as the home place of your image. And terms describing the emergence of the human spirit translate literally as becoming visible, becoming material, presenting this vision of a transition between immanent and material being. And these resonate closely with Deleuze and Guattari's emergent notions of becoming and Hegel's vision of emergent essence. As one Aboriginal elder put it, we all come from the rainbow. And as I said, at the end of life, the spirit has to be ritually sung back to its home place so it can be rejoined the ancestral forces. And there are, of course, all over Australia, many other rainbow stories of giant serpents being very creative. And I'm going to be talking about those a bit next week in the anthropology department. There's a particularly important and quite dangerous ritual involved passing through the rainbow, which involves immersion in water. And this entails in infusing and so enlightening the initiate with secret and sacred knowledge. So in this cultural context, water, light, and the rainbow in particular are objects of considerable wonder, and the sacred water places in which intense concentrations of ancestral force are believed to reside are treated with huge respect. Now, my second very brief example draws on a study I did in the catchment area of the River Stour in Dorset. This is the location of Hardy's novels, The Tolpuddle Martyrs, long-term dairy farming, and now a favoured retirement area for wealthy London bankers. But there's a couple of sacred sites that I thought you might enjoy. One is at Cerne Abbas, where Britain's most famously robust fertility figure, the Cerne Abbas giant, adorns the chalk hillside. And below the hillside lies St. Augustine's well, an ancient holy well that gives us a glimpse of history in which Celtic and then Roman water deities were propitiated with votive offerings and well dressings. And these beliefs and practices were subsumed by Christian saints who appropriated these places' magical and healing powers. And of course, although this well predates the influx of Christianity to the region, in a story suggesting a little bit of competitiveness with the phallic figure on the hill, St. Augustine is said to have stuck his staff into the ground and water spurted forth, so forth. And both pagans and Christians still toss coins into the well and tie little ribbons on the trees next to it in another pagan ritual. And it's also rumored that people continue to perform fertility rites in the fields around the giant, but I draw the line at that level of participant observation.
With the bankers.
No, some things beyond the call of duty. The early Christians were probably less inclined towards such bacchanalian rituals, but they made intense use of holy water in baptisms, exorcisms, and mortuary rituals. And of course, the Bible is awash with images of water as the flow of life and spiritual being, thanks to a patriarchal God and Christian notions of water. And these are generally framed in two key ways. First, in terms of God's beneficence in producing rain for agriculture, which is regularly mentioned. So we have Matthias Claudius's 1782 hymn, which became very popular in Germany as Wir pflügen in wir struen, and translates into English as we plow the fields and scatter. I don't know if you know this hymn here. I Google translated it as Ariamo I campi I spargiamo. But you can all relax. I'm not going to sing it for you. So it does start, we plow the fields and scatter the good seed on the land, but it is fed and watered by God's almighty hand. And he sends the snow in winter, the warmth, the swell, the grain, the breezes, the sunshine, the soft, refreshing rain. But the strongest emphasis on water imagery in the Bible is related to moral purity and virtue, and is most often presented as an enlightening flood of knowledge and wisdom. So sometimes these two streams of meaning are combined, as for example in the Prayer for Pilgrims by Edmund Hage, which asks us, God, to soften my heart, O God of living waters, that the shower of scripture I'm about to read may enrich the soil of my soul, and so forth. Ideas about water and spiritual enlightenment are also very nicely illustrated at another sacred site in Dorset, at the head of the River Stour, where the river literally springs up within the estate of Stour Head, which is now very well-known National Trust property. And you'll be pleased to hear that this famous 17th century garden provides us not only with a classic celebration of water and light, in enabling wonderful religious and aesthetic experiences, but it's also based on appreciation of Italian Renaissance gardens. So it's got a lot of paths composed of that meander through a series of temples and so forth, and they're intended to represent a journey of enlightenment, although slightly oddly they end in the graveyard back at the church. So, but they circumnavigate this giant lake around which there are picnic areas and benches on which people can and do sit and gaze at the water. And there's even a grotto, a little tufa grotto, very classic Italian Renaissance, constructed in which there's a pellucid pool of water, a nymph, a prayer or poem, and so forth. And of course, during the course of this study, I interviewed a lot of people beside the lake and alongside the river and therefore, and they were all taking part in various recreational activities, walking, canoeing, fishing, but of course, in many cases, just gazing at the water. And conversations about why they were doing so were quite illuminating, because over and over again, they used terms like mesmerising, hypnotic, meditative, and how it allowed their thoughts and imaginations to run freely. And they noted the healing qualities of being there. So it appears that the visual interplay of light and water was the most powerful influence enabling them to connect with place in a way that they described as being substantially different from their normal way of being in the world. And the beautiful shimmering water also plainly represented unspoilt nature, although there were anxieties about the river being polluted. So I interviewed a local artist who produced a lot of river paintings, but he said that if it became severely polluted, he'd have to stop painting it. So it's clear that for people living along the Stour, as elsewhere, that the water and light was an object of wonder. And these kinds of engagements are replicated all around the world. And although Britain is an increasingly secular society, it's very clear that people continue to conduct rituals around water to valorize it in other ways. So, for example, at St. Augustine's Well, the vicar now not only conducts rituals celebrating water at the Holy Well, he also brings in lots of pagan terms and tries to appropriate all the neo-paganism in the area as well. And then another favorite thing is well dressing. This is based on the Roman ritual of Fontinalia that's gaining a lot of popularity as a way of celebrating wells and springs, and New Age ceremonies similarly valorize water places and their connections. And I've recorded in my own town in Oxford, alongside the Thames, a Celtic revival ritual in which votive offerings are given to the river. And I believe you have a marriage between Venice and the sea here, so you'll all be familiar. And if we nip back to Australia, we'll find a similar thing in Maroochydore, where a ritual that celebrates connections along the local waterways by pouring water from each local stream into a common vessel. And these capacities of light and water to inspire affective connection continue to inspire a lot of poetry. I went to some lovely stuff the other night at Ocean Space, and I'm thinking of Philip Larkin's poem, for example, in which he says, if I were called in to construct a religion, I should make use of water. Going to church would entail affording to dry different clothes. My liturgy would employ images of sousing, a furious devout drench, and I should raise in the east a glass of water where any angled light would congregate endlessly. Nice. So to conclude, what I hope this interdisciplinary approach has shown is that in diverse cultural contexts, people are fascinated and absorbed by the interplay of water and light. And the material properties of these elements produce definable and consistent effects upon them. Changes in heart rate, brain waves, other signs of altered state of being, and also induce feelings of respect, possibly fear, but more often pleasure, delight. And in such engagements, there are important links with notions of wisdom and enlightenment. Now, in the 18th century, Samuel Johnson suggested all wonder is the effect of novelty on ignorance. I think that's a little harsh myself, but sometimes the deepest, most informed insights can produce wonder. But his comment reminds us that wonder can also induce amazement, which is a sense of being overwhelmed or stupefied to the point that we might describe this as a sort of momentary hiatus or suspension of thought. It entails a moment of being present, or if we want to be fashionable, mindful, in a particular affective engagement with the world. And the object of wonder is experienced as being striking, fresh, and new. In essence, wonder involves revelation, and as such, it's intrinsically emergent. Now, the topic of emergence has gained a lot of debate in the arts and scientists, and it's generally regarded by STEM scientists as the emergence of novelty in the world. But it's sometimes called weak emergence, though it might be better described as a broader way of thinking. And it's the idea that it can create tipping points, disruptive events, and in social, biological, ecological systems, and most pertinently, in the human mind and in societal beliefs and values. So visual imageries, sensory experiences, sounds, and so forth can engender emergent responses that alter people's thinking or groups' thinking and their emotional engagements. And of course, it's the purpose of the arts to do just that, which brings us back to Venice. An anthropological view of wonder does several useful things. It provides us with insights into how evolutionary developments and the material properties of water and light co-create human experience. It shows us how, in conjunction with diverse cultural worldviews, these interactions can have direct transformational effects. Wonder is in part a natural human response to particular stimuli, but has the historical use of practices and objects that evoke wonder, for example, in art and religious rituals, tell us it can also be induced or enhanced through the encoding of symbolic meaning. Water and light are experienced as wonderful, not just because they shimmer and sparkle, but because they are understood to contain being and life itself. And this has some potential practical implications. It's well established in the field of environmental anthropology that people's abilities to engage affectively with the material world has a demonstrable effect on their levels of concern about its well-being. Appreciating and valorizing places, whether through aesthetic, social, recreational, or religious engagement, generates care and concern. So if we go back to the 1960s, the author of Silent Spring, Rachel Cancel, put it, "If I had influence with the good fairy who is supposed to preside over the christening of all children, I should ask that her gift to each child in the world be a sense of wonder so indestructible that it would last throughout life." So this suggests to me that instead of just downloading doom and gloom about species extinction, apocalyptic climate change, and the end of times, those of us hoping to encourage more concern about the environment should also highlight what is wonderful about the world we inhabit. We should do our best to ensure that many people experience wonderful engagements with places and things with a view to creating enlightened life ways that are more protective of these. So in the end, this desperate struggle to encourage people to change their practices and be more sustainable, we might all benefit from the wonderful effects of water and light. And the same, of course, can be said for cultural heritage. Here in the city of water and light, all of the elements that evoke wonder are perfectly combined. A glittering architectural legacy and its rich cultural history are surrounded and enlivened by shining animated waterways. And as art historians such as Heiner Krelig have observed, Venice is gloriously celebrated by Canaletти and others. It continues to attract artists of all kinds. So what I hope I've managed to do today in this rather meandering stream of thought is to offer some insights into how and why this beautiful city is the object of so much wonder and fascination, and how this is intrinsically related to people's concerns about it, the rising sea levels that threaten its existence, as well as the pressures of tourism, which of course are caused by its very capacities to evoke wonder. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Veronica, for taking us to so many places and so many, and with a lot of insight. Very, very interesting. I will open to the floor and have a couple of questions myself, but let's first hear from our audience. Questions? Where to start?
Kind of in your research, do you think...
Sorry, you need to shout for me because I'm very deaf.
Okay. It's hard to shout off a microphone. In your research, do you perceive that additional knowledge or education enhances wonder or detracts from wonder? Because at the beginning you talked a lot about the kind of how with science or with technology there's still an experience of wonder, and with dams it's enhanced by the idea of how complex they are. But at the same time, when we discuss a lot of the water wonder, it's a very basic animalistic wonder, as opposed to one that's guided by education.
Thank you. That's a really interesting question. So what kinds of education are involved? I think that what I would say is that wonder is a thing that people do in some form in every society, that there probably isn't a society where people don't experience wonder. So I think there are endless avenues to wonder. And I observe that in the tensions between religion and science, that there's an attempt to claim wonder, if you like, we're the most wonderful because it's all spiritual, or we understand the extraordinary complexity of the world and that's what's wonderful. But I think there are actually, all of these things can be wonderful for people, and that there's no particular sort of educational constellation of things that is needed. I think people will find avenues to wonder wherever, but it's something that we need to enable as much as anything. So I would go for multiple places to wonder and multiple diversity in terms of kinds of experience of wonder. I mean, Franca very kindly lent me an article by Michael Scott in which he talks ethnographically about wonder discourses, which is sort of interesting. But one of the clearest things to come out of his piece is that there are a lot of ways to get there. So that's why I tried to highlight the sort of tensions, but a lot of this is about sort of who's leading the way in our philosophy of life, and whether it's religious leadership or scientific leadership. And there's some very interesting discussions to be had about that. But does that answer your question? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for the beautiful presentation. My question relates to the agentive capacity of wonder. And this idea, I was stuck, and I find it really beautiful, this idea of wonder and safeguarding, how wonder can lead to new forms of safeguarding. And at the same time, so in environmental humanities, there is a long discussion about this question of the necessity of new forms of storytelling in order to safeguard the environment, in order to respond to the current crisis. And your talk got me thinking, it's not a question, but perhaps we don't need new stories. Perhaps we need new material practices and new rituals of wonder that allow us to unlock the potential for, let's say, environmental protection.
Thank you. That's a really helpful question, Magdalena. I think narratives are important because they lead the way into certain types of engagement. And one of the things you can see in Venice these days is a growing narrative about the ecological complexity of the lagoon waterscape. And that's attempting to lead people into engagement with that in a very holistic sense, and to build an appreciation that balances. I mean, you've got this rather lopsided situation in Venice where everybody understands that this is one of the most beautiful cities in the world, and it's so gloriously valorized in terms of its architectural heritage. And balancing that with an appreciation of the ecological heritage in the area seems to me a very important narrative through which you can encourage people to want to safeguard not only the buildings, but all the ecosystems that surround them. So I think you're very right that narrative is a key part of this. And it's about knowledge. And one of the things I've learned working with hunter-gatherers for many years was that we don't pay attention. When I go out bush with Aboriginals, I feel deaf, dumb, blind, and stupid, because I just don't have that quality of attention on the environment. And I've learned so much about taking notice of things, paying attention to things. And one of the things that I think the art world is providing in this discourse is bringing people into engagement with things in a very immediate and affective way. So the ocean space thing I went to the other night was absolutely wonderful in sort of engendering a sense of the spaces beneath the sea and the sounds. And I've worked with a couple of artists in London called Metallurgy, who bring you into engagement with the tiny microscopic little creatures that live in the mud in rivers, which doesn't necessarily sound terribly appealing. But of course, when you get down there in the mud, they're quite extraordinary and very beautiful. So I think that narratives lead the way, but what actually matters is that interface, that attention that people have. That's where the magic happens.
Thank you. Hi. My question really follows from the previous two questions. I just want to add an extra optics, hoping it's helpful, because in Euro discourse, kind of mainstream discourse or historical discourse, wonder is often associated with the numinous or the sacred. Yet the ethnographic and also archaeological, historical materials that you have provided us with also point to a kind of more ordinary, mundane experience of wonder. So we talked about science versus religion, levels of education, discourse. I wonder whether, whether there's also something about this dichotomy of ordinary and extraordinary, prosaic and sacred that can be deconstructed, can be played with, whether it can add to your analysis. Thank you so much. I don't know if it makes sense.
Yes, I think so. It's interesting. I mean, I think we have to recognize that there's a sort of political thread that runs through the sort of debates about what is numinous and what is sacred and what is wonderful. And people, if you think of sacred as a process of sanctifying rather than as something intrinsic to the object, then I think we can get at you know, sanctifying things is what we do, and that can be done via various sort of avenues, whether they're religious or otherwise. And I suppose that's a very anthropological answer, because, you know, to me, religion is something that humans do rather than something that we simply inherit. But of course, when you look at the discussions about wonder historically, they are very firmly located in theology and philosophy, and they're quite hard to disentangle. But that's a historical a reality. But when you work, as Franco and I do, with quite other cultural spaces, you realize that of course that isn't really part of most people's history. It's just dominant. It's the dominant discourse, if you like. I mean, we've barely emerged from the leadership of the church to that of a secular state. But especially here, you know, you're embodying a history, living in a history of religious leadership. But if you think about sanctification as something that people do, then it becomes more of an understanding of a particular mode of engagement with the environment that allows you to see what is there. And maybe sanctifying isn't the right word, maybe just paying attention, being with, appreciating, valorizing, engaging with. So I think it's got more to do with how we are looking and feeling about things than the belief systems that necessarily driving those kinds of experiences. And, you know, some of the discourse we have about mindfulness is slightly tiresome, I suppose, in that it has the same attempt to sort of be a bit preachy about virtue, but I don't think there's anything particularly virtuous about experiencing wonder. I think it's actually more a question of engaging with things in a particular way. I hope it's not too virtuous.
Thank you very much, Veronica. Usually, you know, your prose adds to the wonder of the content. Your prose, your writing is, you know, adds. Thank you for the paper. I'd like to think about attention, as you mentioned, and attention to water, to particular. The shining, the shimmer, brings us to focus on aesthetic experience, the structure of that aesthetic experience. People establish in relation to water and the moving and the shimmering of water. And this allows us as researchers to shift attention from the content of things, the meaning of things, the symbols of things, which are incredibly interesting and necessary to study, but also to the movement of the how of things move and how we relate to them, how we are affected by them. And we do indeed can affect them by the way in which we are touched. So you know, it's not a question, but it's more like I learned, as you mentioned, in the field, this attention, this being attentive to things, to look at things, to find things together, for instance, you know, from the women. But this attention is a way of knowing. So this cross-cultural, you know, this attention to water and attractiveness to water brings us to reflect on these modalities, different modalities of knowledge, which are current. We experience them every day, but we do not pay attention to them. And they complete, these modalities of knowledge complete other modalities of knowledge, you know, simultaneous. It's a comment rather than a question, but your talk.
It's a very helpful comment, and it highlights the difference in my case studies, really, because you know, when you start talking about the rainbow serpent and what it means and what it does, it's very much about the how things are happening. And if I tried to have this kind of conversation with the Aboriginal elders that I worked with, this kind of abstract analysis of wonder would not be meaningful to them. If you ask them a question, they'll give you a specific example, and they'll say, well, the rainbow serpent does this. And this is how it happens. So that it's a sort of taken for grantedness of the wondrous aspect of the rainbow serpent, which is very rarely articulated because it's more in the storytelling and it's simply there. But then it's revealed in the extraordinary respect with which people go to sacred places where there are rainbow serpents in the waterhole. Whereas if you went to the Stour Head Gardens and interviewed people, you could have a conversation about aesthetics, because in that particular cultural space, you've got a long tradition of landscape art and aestheticizing and treating the environment as an aesthetic object. And in a sense, that objectifying is a sort of rather circular way of coming back around to the kind of appreciation that if you didn't have that, you'd probably just take for granted. And when I interview fishers, for example, on the river, they don't sit there aestheticizing the river and seeing the landscape in that way that a painter would, but they know every eddy of water and where the fish are, and they're reading that waterscape in a very intimate way, and they have a huge appreciation of how it all works and what it's doing. So I think what we've got is a sort of contrast between cultural spaces where these things are very articulated in abstract terms and things are objectified, and we have a whole discourse about aesthetics, and those in which the people are find things equally wondrous, but that isn't really what they're talking about most of the time. So it's partly about the kind of discourses that we have. Yeah, no, I'm happy to keep answering questions.
Hi. I was thinking about, you know, the ephemerality of wonder as an experience and the connection of the ephemerality of light and water creating together a rainbow. And then I was also thinking about the sort of cyclical nature of the relationship, for example, of the moon, a full moon on an ocean or a water body, and the predictable kind of part of that, the nature of that. And I was curious, especially when I saw this image that you had of the rainbow serpent, and it's a circle, it suggests this cyclical nature of the rainbow, and which I feel like I kind of associate with being lucky, you know, if you see a rainbow as a form of luck, almost like a happenstance, it's passing. And I was just curious about how, if there is a connection between the rainbow serpent and these people's perception of time.
Yes, you're absolutely right. You put your finger right on it. The rainbow serpent is a way of describing a hydrotheological cycle of time. And what it does in practical terms, is move spirit and matter through time and space. So first of all, you've got a circular notion of time. You haven't got the kind of open times arrow that emerged in the classical era. You've got an idea that life is about replicating the lives of previous generations so that people are born, they become closer to the ancestors as they age, and then when they die, they're reunited with them. So it's a hugely conservative vision of time, which is, of course, one of the reasons that Aboriginal culture has persisted for so many millennia, because it's intrinsically conservative. But the world is full of larger and smaller hydrotheological cycles. And in my book, one of the things I've tackled is the way in which these very localized vision of time and space become enlarged and made more abstract, but still conform to the notion of time, space, because every culture has to deal with the question of how we come into being and where we go when we depart. And so they have to solve this problem. And some of them do it through these very tidy, I mean, this is a very neat, tidy hydrotheological cycle with the rainbow serpent. It's very beautifully, holistically constructed. But if you look at larger hydrotheological cycles, they remain concerned with where we emerge from, how we travel through our lives, and where we then go, and whether we get to be recycled or sent off to some far distant heaven or whatever. So the notion of hydrotheological cycles is very, very interesting, and I will talk about a bit about that next week.
Yeah. Oh, you have a question? Yeah. Yeah.
Try to be brief.
So thank you very much for your wonderful and stimulating talk. I just wanted to ask you whether you tried also a kind of matching or the possibility to work on the issue of electricity at the moment that you are talking about water and light, and there is a technological link, which is also an eco-political link. I refer to the issue, for instance, of hydropower plants in many areas. I'm working in the Mekong area, and this transformation of water in electricity, and also the metaphoric, let's say, lexicon with which we address electricity, fluxes, or things like these, waves even, and so on. Could you find in some way a link between this issue? And this is the pessimistic, let's say, perspective. On the other side, the same thing, I wanted to ask you for what concern more the material culture, let's say, realm, and to think about glasses and mirrors as products of the human handcraft. Especially key knowledge is actually developed here in Venice about this, and the sculpture of glasses, which are made in Murano and so on, really seem to want to bring together again these issue or these elements of light and water with the transparency of glass, and its also fluidity at the moment when it's worked out by human hands. So this is a romantic part of the question.
But they're both wonderful questions. I mean, I think I love the notion of the hydroelectricity being a further extension of the power of water. And if you think about this historically, of course, there's an interesting transition from water mills and the power of water to create work, which is so integral to industrial development, and how that has then moved forward to the notion of creating more power, more water power, through turning it into electricity, which of course then does all these other wonderful things. And one could do a wonderful analysis of how that process has transformed more and more power out of water. So it's a lovely topic to think about, but I won't blether on because I know we're running out of time. Mirrors. Well, I have a passion for glass. I first came to Venice when I was 10, and at that time I can remember being totally enamored of watching people with little blobs of glass turned into, and it caught my imagination. And I've been quite obsessed by glass ever since. And of course, what is the first mirror for humans? It is, of course, water. And to some extent, one imagines glass and mirrors as an attempt to replicate that beautiful object into a more permanent form. And of course, what we're always trying to do with material culture is to stabilize the things that we value, to create stability. So the question about ephemerality sort of connects with this. Water and so forth is very, fluids are very ephemeral. They're glitter, they shine, but they don't stand still. And so if you think about mirrors and glass as a way to capture the essence of water, I think it's actually a lovely way to think about why we have all these glittering mirrors and surfaces everywhere, because that's what we're doing. We're trying to capture that magical glitter, and of course to reflect ourselves in it, which is part of the process, to see ourselves as part of that world. So thank you. That's two very lovely questions.
Following up from Amalia's question, I wonder, to go onto the very dark side, I know you often deal with darkness as well, concerned with water, not only with the light. So, I mean, is in a sense this process of disenchantment that we've been going through for the past 200 years or so, isn't that also connected with a particular history of capturing water and making it invisible and damming it and creating, alienating, in a sense, humans from, transforming the enchantment into whatever the language that we have, resource or pollution or contamination, stuff like that. And now flooding and all of that.
No, it's true. I think that's a really interesting point, because we tend to have a kind of narrow vision of sort of science and capitalism as reducing things to resources and exploiting them, which of course is true. And of course, water and power are always inextricable. You've probably all read Wittfogel and the notion of political power. You can only have political power if you control water. You can't really have any kind of political power unless you've got some degree of control over water. And so I tend to think about this as a relationship of power between humans and the non-human domain. And the history of water infrastructure is one of imposing power over that domain and channeling water into needs. And you've got a beautiful example here in Venice with the diversion of the rivers from the lagoon into creating drier farmland and sending the water elsewhere and so forth. And that's a story that's repeated ad nauseum across the world, that water flows have been redirected into human interests more and more and more and more. And that is a relationship of power over water, which it doesn't allow ecosystems to function as they should. So in that sense, it's distortive. Having said that, that's the dark side of it. But there's a sort of understory to things like mining and resource use and visions of generating wealth that are also very positive. I mean, you probably all know how difficult it is to dislodge governments from the notion that growth is intrinsically good, because it's very difficult to say that growth is bad unless you're thinking about cancers or whatever. And so there's a whole, and when you interview miners, they're so excited by this hunt for treasure, which can be brought to the surface and revealed. So there's a whole aesthetic side to mining and dams and drilling and discovering. So that on the one hand, you might think of it as being rapacious, but on the other hand, it's also generative with a particular worldview, if you just ignore all the externalization of the costs that it entails. But it is there. There's a whole aesthetic of dams. And when I interview miners and engineers, they're so proud of these massive dams, and they are an extraordinary feat of accomplishment. And if you've ever gone hunting for things like sea glass or shells or jade at the beach, you'll know that feeling of discovering treasure. And it's perhaps a little bit inbuilt. I mean, we do have a long history of gathering.
One last question? Oh, two more. Three more. Three more questions? Three more?
Yeah, no, it's fine. They're all lovely questions.
Um,
Do
if I
shout.
may go first, otherwise I can wait for the other one. It's not a problem. Okay. Well, I have some more question. I will try to sum it up. Well, first of all, I want to link to two previous questions about the time and the aesthetics. Like, I have the feeling that we can experience different lights according to the latitude, for example. We can see, for instance, in Venice, we have lots of tourists who are amazed about the beauty of the city, also because they have experienced other lights, because they come from different parts of the world. So, but on another side, as someone told us before me, we are less and less amazed if we live here, because we live a rush life. So it's becoming more and more difficult for us living and studying in Venice to stop and think and be wondered about. So my question is if there's a role of monotony living here and not being used, maybe being less used to stop and to wonder about the light and the water. And if also maybe mass tourism can have a role in it, because we have also talked about the role of humans in our relationship to nature. That is something that we, in my opinion, we can't avoid nowadays because our presence on the art space is so diffused. So it's kind of, are we rethinking our relationship to water? Well, not to light, but to water or to other natural aspects, considering that it's something that we can't avoid, this interference, this human interference in the nature nowadays.
That's an interesting question. I mean, you're basically suggesting that, you know, familiarity diffuses the wonder that you feel in looking at things. I think it's more a mode of being than a question of familiarity. I mean, I live in Oxford, city of dreaming spires. We have the same pressures of tourism as well as traffic that you have here. And it is very easy to become sort of inured to the beauty of the environment. And in a sense, you have to make a conscious effort. And I suppose that's what people are trying to talk about wonder, are saying that you can actually bring yourself into a state of paying attention. Sometimes you just have to remember to pay that kind of attention. So I'm sure that if you put your mind to it, you would consciously place yourself in a mode of paying attention that would renew your sense of the place. I think it's always something that you can regain, one hopes. It'd be an awful shame to think that all of you who live here in Venice, you're like, oh yeah, I've been there, done that, got the T-shirt now. It's not wonderful anymore. I'm sure it continues to be wonderful. I hope so.
And if I may, one last, I as well. Do you have the feeling, have you had the feeling in your research that the relationship between your interviewed people and water and light, especially water, because of climate change, can change in the future? Because we have regions in the world where the presence, the amount of waters like floods, unfortunately, we also have experienced in these days in Italy, will raise and raise because of climate change, because of new phenomena, but also regions that are becoming more and more desertic. So there's a lack of water. So that's the opposite aspect. And if you have the feeling that these perceptions, these rituals can change in the future, according to your research.
What I notice interviewing people around the world about water is that there is a lot of striving in many communities to rediscover a sense of belonging in place and community. And people go about it in lots of different ways. You know, where I live, it's a lot of it about creating, you know, neighborhood communities. A lot of it's about reconnecting with the non-human domain very consciously. There's a huge rise in neo-paganism, for example, in the UK. And I think that you know, this is something that you can feel with so many communities out there. There are always some people who are really keen to tip the balance into other ways of doing things. What I kind of hope in my work is that there'll be a confluence of movements. So you've got the indigenous protests and counter movements, you've got your environmental conservation movements, you've got your feminist social justice movements, you've got increasing communications technology, so that all of these movements are talking to each other. There's a rising conversation about non-human rights and the need for paradigmatic changes in how we think. And I hope, and this may be a tenuous hope, that these things will create a confluence that shifts the direction. I think that's what we all have to hope for, that there'll be a sort of critical mass reached, and then there will be a change in practices. I confess I'm not wildly optimistic that we're going to get there in time, but I think we have to keep trying for that.
And on that note, thank you, Veronica. Thank you, everyone, and people online. And
Yes.
yes, let's hope. Let's hope.
Thank you for